our elections, and you have until then. You can do that by email or legalise.com. Until then, I call such order and call upon the record secretary to meet for the last part of this meeting.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to my good friends Angie and Angelina and Arabella for helping me make it this far and for supporting me all the way. Anyway, but when I heard this, this was the motion for the debate, this house would legalise all sex work, I was slightly confused because I didn't realise sex involved work. I don't do any of the work. But some people really like to put some work into it, and for those people that's fair enough. I mean, if they want to, they should be able to really go for it. But no, in all seriousness, should you be able to profit from sex? Well, plenty of other people use their bodies to create a stream of income, and it's all completely legal. Rugby players, basically anyone who's a professional athlete, strippers, bodybuilders, PE teachers, lifeguards, masseuses. I don't know if that's the plural of masseuse. Is it masseuse? Anyway, all of these people make money from their body. It's crazy carry on. But because I know people don't really do their research before coming to these debates, I will outline the current legislation surrounding sex work in Ireland. It is legal to sell sex services in Ireland, but it is not legal to buy sexual services. And I know what you're thinking, that doesn't really make sense. And yeah, I know, it's kind of like saying, oh, you want to sell groceries? That's fine, we love groceries. We're super progressive, and we think that if you want to sell groceries, then that's something you should be able to do. That's your choice, and go for it. Look, we'll even let you build your own supermarket, but you can't advertise. And if a guard doesn't like the look of your groceries, you will be asked to move. But you can set up your supermarket, although not on the same premises as anyone else. But you can now set up your super value, and you're all good to go, ready to make business, and we're totally cool with that. However, it will be illegal for anyone to step inside, and it'll be illegal for anyone to say, how much for the avocados? And it'll certainly be illegal if they purchase anything from your shop. Sounds pretty weird and silly, right? Yeah, anyway, looking forward to hearing this debate about super value. Thank you.
Welcome to our second to last debate of the year, guys. It's getting emotional. We have our last one next week at 7:30, shocker, with a wide reception as normal afterwards, so please do come along with that. That will be on this Facebook Guild diet. Just to run through the standard orders for tonight's debate, speeches for 7 minutes in length for students and 10 minutes in length for guests. Our lovely treasurer Lika will time keep for us. The first and last minute of your speech are protected time, meaning no further information to be offered. Aside from that, we do encourage audience participation, so do feel free to offer points of information at any other stage. We will get our tutors the way in, so please be sure to fill this in, as our speakers can be awarded medals and cash prizes at the end of the year based on them. You can give them to your minimum to the way out, or put them in the ballot box just there. Respect and inclusivity are a priority for us here at HIS, so if anything you hear tonight upsets you or you have any concerns about it, please do reach out to our lovely equity officer Nina at equity@his.com. For now, I should like to call on our correspondence secretary to introduce tonight's invited guest to the house.
So we have one lovely guest with us today. Her name is Kate McGrew, and she is a sex worker advocate that has served on the board of Sex Workers Alliance in Ireland, and we are so delighted to have her with us today.
With that in mind, I think we're ready to get straight into the debate. So, question for you guys this evening is: this house will legalise all sex work? And I'd now like to call on the first speaker to propose the motion as no comment.
Jesus, okay. Tonight, I am shocked, I am appalled, I am frankly disgusted that this society would associate itself with a profession so vile, so depraved, so devoid of morality, that it would bring into question our very character. Yes, lawyers. Sex workers are totally fine. So, this issue will frankly never have a perfect solution, but I say we can certainly do better than we currently are. I'd like to start by getting us on the same page a bit by talking about how we define sex work and also what the current models are, though I only gave a little bit of introduction there. Sex work can encompass a lot of different things depending on who you ask, including pornography, strippers, dominatrixes, but James Ryan's search history aside, there is of course paying for physical sexual acts, and most legal restrictions and frameworks are generally about this because things that are related to anything online, that's technology, that's a bit more of an international jurisdiction, and then anything that doesn't involve actual physical contact usually is more legal, so kind of going to focus a bit more there. There's a few broad categories of countries' laws on this. There's full-on prohibition. It's completely illegal. This is the approach taken in most of the US. It's in Russia, a lot of East Asia, a lot of Muslim countries. This is dehumanizing the sex workers. If they're being exploited, this is ridiculous. And also the way that US police have treated them in their investigations is quite disgusting, and I'm not going to detail it here. There's abolitionism, where it's legal but third-party involvement is illegal, such as in Britain, Poland, and India. There's also neo-abolitionism, often referred to as the Nordic model. It's quite close to what Ireland has. Again, it's legal to sell sex on behalf of yourself, but it is illegal to sell on someone else's behalf, and it's illegal to purchase it. The idea is if you remove the option, the number of sex workers will go down, and again, if you think it's exploitation, that kind of makes sense. You don't want to be persecuting the victims. Then there is legalization, and there's a bit of a line to draw here. Legalization often is used, and I'm using quote marks intentionally, is often referring to a very specific strategy where they legalize it, but they have a lot of very strict requirements for what it takes to become a sex worker, how brothels operate. This is why the model that's used in New Zealand is called decriminalization, even though it's, if you read it, it kind of reads more like a legalization because basically they don't really have a very tight framework of requirements to do that. The thinking behind that is when you legalize it but you have a lot of strict requirements, you're just basically creating a two-tiered system in which the most vulnerable people who are doing sex work are still kept outside the law, which is harmful for them. Which model we think is best comes down, frankly, to kind of two broad questions, whether we consider it morally acceptable and harm reduction. We often need to choose which we value more in issues like this. I say it's harm reduction. I think there are reasonable points to be made for opposing sex work on principle, and the question for consent on anything when money gets involved can very easily become a gray area with vulnerable people, and there will always be something that you can easily argue as exploitation. If our principles bring us to this conclusion that sex work is exploitative again, abolitionist models kind of might make sense. Outlaw third-party involvement in purchasing sex, and you target the people really doing the harm, but this is frankly naive. There are two things when you think about law. There are the motives behind our laws, and there are their actual impacts. Unfortunately, these don't always align. First off, when you ban third parties and purchasing, it forces sex workers to operate in more unsafe environments without the safety of being in public or having potential witnesses to corroborate their stories, to corroborate literally anything. But it's worse than just that. I'd like to tell you a story. Last year, I met someone we'll call Charlie. I'd heard lots about them, my friends said we'd get along, and we did, and I was in all of them in our conversation, and so happy I got to meet them. At some point, we realized that they used to live near where I was living in Dublin at the time. Charlie told me that while they were living there, they realized there was a brothel basically right beside them. One day, Charlie was talking to a member of the guards that they had some personal relationship with, and sort of subtly asked them if they knew about this. The guard turned dead serious all of a sudden, and basically said, "We didn't have this conversation. We know about it, and it's run by organized crime, and we're not messing with them. For your own safety, keep quiet about it." So one night, Charlie heard someone calling for help. They couldn't really be certain where from, but that sounded bad, and they didn't call the guards. After a bit more noise, everything was quiet again. When I heard that, like I'm sure many of you are now, I was fucking horrified. But as I thought about it, I couldn't say with certainty that I wouldn't have done the same in that situation, because it scared me. When you criminalize everyone but the sex workers, you make a gap that one, organized crime fills, and every criminalized party has every incentive to keep them silent. They trap them in that life with dependence, with threats, and above all, fear. Where there is fear, there is power. No passion so effectively robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear. So these gangs sow fear. They threaten violence, they use violence, they make sure that everyone does what they want them to do or stays out of their way. And it works. By pushing people below the surface, you leave them at the mercy of the underworld. I haven't discussed human trafficking so far. It is obviously horrendous, but just the same, when we create a system where no one can come forward safely, then we put them in greater danger. Solving that issue isn't a simple legislative one. Saying that you're going to ban sex work isn't going to solve human trafficking. Legalization will not be perfect, but it's better than status quo. Firstly, when you make it legal, you can have at least some protections for it. People are safe coming forward, and if you're someone who's going to be buying this and you have an option to do it without risking criminal prosecution, you're probably a lot more likely to do that. This drives down demand. I hate that I'm doing economic analysis for this, but I don't think criminal organizations are going to be reading the literature anytime soon. So it becomes far less profitable, and if it's not profitable, it's less likely organized crime are going to do it. Second, if you're someone that was going to resort to sex work, you're less likely to end up being exploited by an organized crime group because you won't need to solely rely on them if you need some level of group or some standing, that you don't have to do this work where you live. Third, people engaging in this work are more safe and can have actual legal protections because we acknowledge the existence of the other parties. They can access services to support them, they can unionize, you can monitor brothels, you can give them access to workers' rights. There are many ways we can go about it, but whatever system we design, we have to let sex workers be part of that process.
Thank you very much for that wonderful speech. And now I shall first speaker from the opposition, Legalise.
Do you think you can time me? Yeah, so firstly, I just want to build on what Anya said. Personally, I've never met a man that makes sex work, but like, if anybody has a problem with that, email censor@thehist.com, I don't care. Many thanks to Anne for a wonderful speech, but I do have to disagree with you. I think you were arguing a lot of points on destigmatization instead of legalization. So I have to agree with the House's motion in general on this House would legalise sex work. Owen did give a definition of sex work. I'm just going to reiterate that really fast. And it's escort services, the porn industry, stripping, prostitution. And look, I want to make it clear to the House that I completely believe in the destigmatisation of sex work. I myself have engaged in a form of prostitution since 2019, when I began selling my body to capitalism, because that's when I started working Tesco. Thanks, Son, I really appreciate it. Every little does in fact not help. The main focus of my speech will be centred around the full legalisation of prostitution, because I don't see a reason that other occupations that come under sex work, like engaging in the production or the distribution of pornography, should be illegal. Heavily regulated, yes. Illegal, no. The two arguments I'm going to put forward to the House against full legalisation of prostitution, my main argument being something that Owen already talked about, and to the House is probably the most obvious argument, the human trafficking argument, because it would be an embarrassment to the opposition if we did not talk about this. And how a legalisation of sex work won't help the state combat human trafficking. My second argument would be how the legalisation of prostitution isn't a gift to sex workers. It's a gift to pimps, to traffickers, and to the sex industry, and does not care about the actual sex workers who work in it. So you're gonna have to bear with me on this. I fucking hate this feminist rhetoric that has made prostitution look like it's completely safe, and it's somehow become taboo to talk about the negative side of prostitution and the sex industry in general, because we have to talk about sex trafficking. Human trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, and deception with the aim of exploiting them for profit. Men, women, and children of all ages and from all backgrounds can be victims of this crime, which occur in every region of the world. And it might not seem like media doesn't really report on it in Ireland, but it does happen in Ireland. The traffickers also use violent or fraudulent employment agencies and fake promises of education and job opportunities to trick and coerce their victims. The legalisation or decriminalisation of prostitution industries, to me, it would be one of the main reasons that human trafficking will become more prevalent in Ireland. One argument for legalising prostitution in the Netherlands was that legalisation would help to end the exploitation of desperate immigrant women who had been trafficked there for prostitution. Spoiler alert, it didn't. It kind of only made things worse because it was regulated, because it was like quote unquote fucking safer. No, it wasn't. One report found that 80% of women in the brothels in the Netherlands were trafficked from other countries. The International Organization of Migration in 1994 stated that in the Netherlands alone at that point, nearly 70% of trafficked women were from Central and Eastern European countries. And now just another part of this argument is the legalization,
Did they have statistics before it was legalized?
They have statistics in here because it's from the International Organization of Migration. The second part of my argument that will go into human trafficking is the legalisation of prostitution and decriminalisation of the sex industry increases child prostitution. Another argument for legalising prostitution in the Netherlands was that it would help end child prostitution. Yet child prostitution in the Netherlands has increased dramatically since the 90s. The Amsterdam-based child rights organisation estimates that the number of children in prostitution in 5 years between 1996 and 2001 increased 300%. Like, what? And it went from, It went from 4,000 children in 1996 to 15,000 in 2001. Child Right estimates that at least 500 of these children in dust prostitution are trafficked from other countries, with a large segment being from West African countries. Child prostitution, it's increased dramatically in the state of Victoria in Australia compared to other states. Like the highest number of reported instances of child prostitution come from Victoria. This is just specifically an Australian argument that I came across. And just specifically, we were to regulate it, and obviously we're not going to regulate for child trafficking or human trafficking. In general, we regulate for prostitution. Basically, we would have to include in our legislation a defensive mistake as to age, as is with all other defilement defences, because constitutional right, you can't bring that defence up. People lie. How are you going to sit there and tell me, oh, yeah, I did hire a prostitute, that's legal. I'm so sorry that it was a fucking child. She looked 19, she was 12, which is most of the arguments for defilement defences in Ireland. My last argument that I will end on is legalisation and decriminalisation of prostitution is a gift to pimps, traffickers and the sex industry, not sex workers themselves. What does legalisation of prostitution or decriminalisation of the sex industry mean? In the Netherlands, legalisation amounts to sanction of all aspects of the sex industry, the women themselves, the buyers, the pimps. Under a regime of legalisation, are transformed into third-party businessmen and legitimate sexual entrepreneurs. Legalisation or decriminalisation of the sex industry also converts brothels, sex clubs, massage parlours, other sites of prostitution activities into legitimate venues where commercial sexual acts are allowed to flourish legally. Some people believe that in calling for legalisation or decriminalisation of prostitution, they dignify the professionals, but they don't. It simply dignifies the industry. In these types of places, like in the Amsterdam, the money doesn't mainly go to the prostitutes, it goes to the pimps, it goes to the sex industry, and these women they're just fucked over, they're just left there. People often don't realise that decriminalisation means the entire industry gets decriminalised. They haven't thought of the consequences of legalising pimps as legitimate sex entrepreneurs or third-party businessmen, or the fact that men who buy women for sexual activity are now accepted as, they're going to be accepted as legitimate consumers of sex. In countries where women are criminalised for prostitution activities, it's crucial to advocate for the decriminalisation of women in prostitution. And I really believe that, but not for the full legalisation of prostitution. That's just some of my arguments. I put forward 2 arguments. It's human trafficking and that sex work, or the decriminalisation, legalisation of sex work won't benefit sex workers, it'll only benefit You're right too. I've seen I've gone over time. This is my last chamber debate I'll ever do because I'm graduating in 4 weeks, and I want to say thank you to the entire Hiss and to my main man Jim out there. He's really been a real one. I'm going to ask real nicely that you guys let me take my be real because I'm not going to commemorate this moment. Thank you, Owen, for laughing at my jokes. You know what? Thank you, Owen, for always being a real one. Okay. I said to so many people I was going to do this. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks again for having me. I'd like to say I have a few things written down that I'd like to discuss. There are so many I'd like to talk about as an escort myself. I'm happy to have a memoir contract with Mercier Press. So there will be a book of 200 pages plus coming out where I unpack everything. So you should all look for that when it comes out. And otherwise, link me online if you want to discuss things. Probably Instagram, but Kate McGrew can be found too many places online. So look me up. Okay. So we can all agree that sex work will always exist in some way, shape, or form. Aye? Now, I say not as a value judgment that we can all agree that sex work is indisputably an economic activity. Aye? So, to respond a little bit about what yourself was just saying there about trafficking and decrim, etc., just want to point out that trafficking occurs on the far end of exploitation in any industry, and no more appealing place for criminals than a black market. So, for example, in the United States, when they recently criminalized advertising entirely, there was a website called Backpage.com. It's free advertising for people, so it would often be where a lot of people with less options, less agency are advertising. What they discovered in talking to agencies that tried to address human trafficking is that when they criminalized all of advertising in the United States, it made the work of anti-human trafficking organizations that much harder because their channels had essentially been shut down and further hidden. This is just one example of the ways that further illegality, further criminalization really does make it harder the most and compromise most the people suffering the worst in this industry. Pre-2017, in Ireland, it was already legal to sell sex as long as I was alone. The current law, for the first time ever, criminalized our clients, as well as criminalizing working in pairs or groups, increasing penalties for people working in pairs or groups, and introducing a potential jail sentence. Now, I ask you, do you think that the law of not purchasing sex could in any reality have prevented the atrocity that occurred in Limerick in April 2022 with the murder of Gila Ibrahim? In what world would a man willing to break the law of not murdering people be deterred from doing so by a law against purchasing sex? Proponents callously say that the law is intended towards the future benefit of a shrunken industry, of decreased demand, that hopefully this would mean fewer women's lives will end in tragedy like Gila's. But even proper clients have not been deterred from participating in what was already a shamed upon activity. Even proper clients living in the many places they are criminalized have not been deterred by illegality. This law was imported from Sweden and slapped down into Ireland with no regard for the situation here. Sweden, where a sex industry has thrived in the 20 years since they've passed this law. I have many friends that work there. I've worked there myself. And what I noted in working there is a lot of what my friends would have told me as well. Non-sex workers, they treat us either like scum or as pitiable sufferers of the convenient catch-22 of false consciousness, i.e. we don't really know what we want and need. The clients in Sweden I found to be more entitled and more demanding, perhaps due to their increased power of negotiation, as becoming the party perceived to be taking more risk in the law. And I also found them to be more perverted. Perhaps due to a society so vastly applying a repression of their desires. As an outsider, allow me to say that I perceive that Ireland knows the inefficacy and the dangers of using shame as a tool of control. Ours is the only profession where we are asked to prove to you that we would not do the work if we weren't paid for it. We're asked to prove to you that we're already perfectly safe. We're asked to prove to you that we even feel empowered in order for us to have some parameters around the work that would just keep us that bit safer. If this were the ask for other jobs, there would be no need for unions anywhere, as opposed to the existence of unions for every other kind of worker everywhere. Sex work is work that people can do when they have little to nothing else besides their own body. There are zero barriers to entry into the industry. Partially due to the illegality of sex work, it's work that people in the most desperate situation will always be tempted towards. And due to the illegality, the entire industry operates in an effective black market. So there is exceptional potential for the exploitation of people. This reality means that the laws we draw must accommodate around the needs and lacks of the specific demographics of people in the industry. Groups that are overrepresented as sex workers are single migrant mothers, they're LGBT youth, they're trans people, homeless people, drug users, and the undocumented. No small feat. Yet any humane society must at least try to come up with legislation that can realistically give recourse to justice and safer options for people facing down a law. It's unfair to people in the sex industry today to meanwhile have no protections from the state and only intolerance and shame from society. Irish society should be more ashamed that Gila had only the conditions in which she was able to be murdered and without hardly a mention in the media. The Irish government should be more ashamed that they increased criminalization of working in pairs, more ashamed that they are nowhere near considering a law to allow someone like Gila to at least have the option of a vetted space to work from or security at the door. Sex work should not be normalized, per se, or even encouraged. There are spaces where sex work does occur as a job that can be seen as community care, as alchemy, or even as art. But the industry remains a minefield to navigate, mostly regards to the law and the subsequent issues with safety and fallout from stigma, but also regards to the need for a unique kind of psychological fortitude for such an intimate kind of community of customer service. Especially when people are doing this work as an extension of life experiences, aka trauma that led them there. Especially when people are working things out. The landscape needs to be safe as possible for people to traverse. Like abortion, in a humane society, sex work would be safe and legal, but we would not shy away from the seriousness of it as a topic. Camille Paglia generously said, prostitutes control the sexual channels between nature and culture. We see what happens when we don't have infrastructure from which we can exercise some control. The issue of sex work is the most base on so many levels. Appropriate legislation around it would have an effect that could lead to compassionate policies up the chain of civilization. A change in legislation would be a marginal improvement, but it's a step we must take. We must make the effort to draw some lines in this wilderness for what suits in Ireland and what is realistic for its workers specifically, with the realistic flexibility around zoning and licensing, again, to address that decriminalization is not a free-for-all. In fact, it does include zoning, it does include licensing, etc. Legalization, more specifically decriminalization, needs to be the backbone against which we have the space to focus on deeper, more important work. How do we foster social harmony in a changing population in Ireland? Deeper again, what are the components within a society, within culture, of education and community that are needed to prevent children from growing up into individuals who choose violence? Meanwhile, it's a matter of urgency to adopt legislation that effectively protects the people who are most vulnerable to harms in society. At least this, as we collectively push for change in attitudes towards social cohesion and state systems to provide for the material needs of all people. By addressing problems at the root, might we move towards a society where we see fewer actions of violence and greed. Sex is uncivilized. In the words of poet Ginsberg, at least when it's good. Civilization was created with the intention to put some parameters around our animal nature. We're conscious animals, and so we must deal with things conscientiously for all of us. We highlight and organize, we regulate and legislate around complicated situations to address the messy manifestations of our other primal instincts, like tribalism, territoriality, difficult as it may be to continually figure out, for example, the best strategies to help refugees and victims of war. Sex is the realm where people embody their most primal nature. In the sexual act, in the lawlessness of the transaction, it is therefore the realm that more so than any other needs to be given space in civilization. It's a messy endeavor in the realm of sex, where the whole point is letting go of your inhibitions in order to procreate, mind you, as in we are biologically driven to fuck. To not reckon with the existence of an industry that revolves around the only reason any of us exist, i.e. copulation, and one of the most very enjoyable activities. To not reckon with the existence of an industry around this activity that is also the catch-all industry for the vast array of society's most marginalized individuals. Surely this is the quintessential blind spot for any species attempting to be humane. Thank you.
I will preface this to say I do not study law. Growing up, I loved reading. When I was in my 6th grade class, my English teacher handed me a book, Sold, written by Patricia McCormack. I was eager to finish this book as it began with the story of Lakshmi, a young girl from Nepal sold into sex slavery because her family was experiencing financial hardship. At the young age of 11, previous to this novel, I saw sex as a romanticized liberatory movement present in shows like Sex and the City that my mom secretly watched late night evenings. But through the descriptive and violent language to describe the violation Lakshmi experienced was frightening in my adolescent mind. Sex work has historically been a profession that has coerced young adolescents to engage in due to extreme poverty or undesirable circumstances. And now mainstream society has a romanticized liberatory force through the popularization and romanticization of platforms like OnlyFans and more. I must confess, though, the closest I've ever been to sex work has been the racist comparisons between myself and Mia Khalifa because of course, every brown girl with a pair of glasses and a hijab must be a lookalike. But my lack of engagement with sex work is not because of my distance to poverty or obvious religious nature. It is because I have found other alternatives to a very predatory field. Growing up, before I put on my hijab, I was often characterized by my looks and told to go into modeling. Honestly, if it wasn't for my family's own struggle to put me through school and constantly affirm alternatives to easy money, maybe I would be a model today. I understand that that's not the case for everyone. Through the oversaturation obsession with looks, sex work has become a field that is now associated and affirmed with libertarian movements for reclaiming your own sexuality and body. While this debate is not to contest that, and I firmly believe sex workers, those in their own consent, are to be respected, I remain opposed to the motion to legalize all sex work because sex work is not a field that should be completely romanticized, and legalizing the field would not further the safety measures for the sex workers who hope to remain safe in their field, which I believe is a primary argument for the proposition. Legalization and legal processes often involve courts. In recent years, it is reasonable to question whether or not they have stood beside sex workers and brought them justice. The opposition may argue, oh, well, if cops and courts are inciting violence towards sex workers, legalization can allow for punitive measures to be placed on abusive cops and cops. Specifically coming from the United States, cops are often the ones who are violating and creating abusive acts against sex workers. Realistically, though, when has that ever taken place, where the legal courts and cops have protected sex workers? Let's be honest, even in this country, if the Irish Garda can't even help me locate my iPhone when it was stolen right outside of Trinity Gates, how do you think they'll launch an investigation into those preying on sex workers? Sure.
It has occurred in New Zealand that police have been called upon to force a client to pay, etc. There have been numerous people who have gone through the courts.
Yeah, that's only one that's only one instance, and obviously, cultures, societal cultures are very different in every single nation. In understanding the severity and dangers of sex work, it is important to address the violent and often disregarded horrors of sex work, human trafficking, as other speakers have talked about. Similar to my initial introduction to Lakshmi's story and other speakers' affirmation, I think we can all agree that human trafficking is bad. Responding to what Kay had mentioned about criminalizing sex work and human trafficking, in a 2013 study investigating the relationship between human trafficking and legalization, they actually found opposite results where the scale effect of legalized prostitution actually led to the expansion of prostitution market, increasing human trafficking. Through investigating over 150 countries, including New Zealand, researchers concluded that countries with legalized prostitution or sex work experience a larger degree of human trafficking inflows. Despite the trafficking nature of sex work, it is unreasonable for me to stand here and act like many sex workers do not consent to sex work without coercion. However, legalization detrimentally impacts the vulnerability of those who do not consent to this industry and have been coerced and sold into the industry. It is imperative to recognize that sex workers, as rightful workers, have had to navigate a system that has never worked for them. This has allowed to develop and institute realistic and helpful measures that allow them to protect each other and themselves, not through the courts and not definitely through the police. I call on the audience, to understand that debate is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. We can oppose this motion and still be pro-sex work. We can oppose this motion and believe sex work is real work because it is. However, we must realize that bringing in cops and legal government is not the answer. To actually stand in solidarity with those most vulnerable, why should we impose deficient solutions to parties that we are not necessarily engaged in? We get to the liberal glass of, oh, we support sex workers, they're legal now. But sex workers have to rework their entire mechanism of safety accountability to allow cops to enforce this system when historically they are the ones to bring violence into this industry as well. The alternative, you may ask, is decriminalization, as you had mentioned yourself. Decriminalization allows for sex workers to feel validated in their careers, but does not encourage the predatory industry, nor does it allow for punitive and abusive governmental interference to take place. The Red Project in the UK is an organization that is exemplary of the manners in which non-governmental organizations can themselves be a step above decriminalization without legalizing the industry to further provide safety measures to vulnerable sex workers. They provide tips for safety, confidential emotional support, STD testing, safety planning, and more. The government is not necessarily going to always save us, so why are we always looking to the government to institute safety and control? Some other arguments to bring up into the legalization of sex work is to understand, what does legalization look like? As the first speaker had said, legal restrictions of sex work requires paperwork and licensing, further instituting capitalistic hierarchies favoring pimps, brothels, and other wealthy connected people. When the argument is to empower sex workers to own and reclaim their labor, legalization only favors those who are in control of sex workers. Moreover, going back into human trafficking legislation lacks substantial impact in the Moreover, going back to human trafficking, legalization lacks substantial impact in the black market. And understanding the alternative, decriminalization reduces the risk of human trafficking, as sex workers are able to freely advocate for their own health and safety, eliminating the need for exploitative third parties. When we are prioritizing the rights of sex workers, we must realize the answer is never the easy answer is never the best solution. Stand with the opposition today because after this understanding, we can institute real work for real solutions for sex worker safety. Thank you.
starting in 3, 2, 1. So on my family's weekly Zoom call, I said, oh, I'm speaking in this week's HIS debate. So my mom goes, oh, that's nice. What's the motion? So I tell her, and without batting an eye, the first thing my dad says is, here's a potential dissertation topic. Do we think the gender pay gap applies for sex workers too? So for all of the third years still looking for a dissertation topic, Tim's got you covered. I have 2 points today. I have a practical argument about why Ireland's system is not working and why it will never work. And then I have an abstract argument about why I think legalization is preferable to criminalization. And when I say abstract, I will be referencing an ancient Greek comedy, so do bear with me. In terms of practical notes, despite the fact that I am a debater, I do try to listen to other people's opinions occasionally. So I've cited some sources I think are particularly relevant. Organizations that think that sex work should be legalized. Sex Workers Alliance in Ireland, coming from the people who we are supposed to be protecting ourselves. Amnesty International, I'd say a heavy hitter. And the ACLU. Who, to their credit, had 80 sources on their website. I don't have enough time to go through all 80 of them, but the quick summary is that what they found was when sex work was either decriminalized or legal, violence against sex workers decreased, and the sexual diseases and infections that they received also decreased. That is the concrete data that matters. And I think that this human trafficking argument is incredibly relevant, but I don't think that this applies to the majority of cases. I think this violence and disease stats do. I'd also like to point out that opposition brings to you, but human trafficking increases. Note, I think that these stats they bring you are likely to be somewhat flawed, because I think it's easier to distinguish between what is consensual sex work and what is human trafficking. When people are okay saying, I am a consenting sex worker when it is legal. So I think your data is more likely to be accurate when it is legal, which means that there's more human trafficking on this side of the house may not be true. Note, even if it is true, human trafficking is illegal. Child prostitution is illegal. And I find it very unclear why, if on their side of the house, governments are either unable or unwilling to crack down on human trafficking and child prostitution, why they are able to crack down on pimps, why they're able to crack down on the market which they bring you. I think this doesn't make a lot of sense. So if they tell us that human trafficking increases, and governments aren't doing anything about it, I think it's very unclear as to why they would be doing anything if it is criminalized and why they're cracking down on pimps. Note, I also want to point out that when Ayla tells you pimps benefit more, I believe that. I think Amazon is exploitative, and I think Jeff Bezos benefits a lot from Amazon being legal. But I don't think that's a reason to criminalize Amazon. I think that it's likely true that people at the top are going to benefit more if it's legal. I think that is unavoidable. I think that because we've already talked about how sex work is symmetric on both sides of the house, given that we see a sex work industry in Ireland where it is criminalized, where people can, and for the record are, I was looking at the crime stats, punished to some extent for soliciting sex. I think this exists on both sides of the house, and I think pimps are benefiting on both sides of the house. So I think what we should really care about is the well-being of the sex workers, and by violence and disease is better on our side of the house. Now, moving on to our abstract argument. I'm not convinced we haven't stigmatized sex work because we don't believe because we're not confused about why men should have to pay for sex. I'm genuinely not convinced. I want governments to treat sex work like work. I want it to be treated with dignity, respect, and with the utmost importance placed on the workers' safety. I want sex work to be held to the same standards as regulation for underwater welding, which, as it turns out, is actually one of the most dangerous professions you can have. Fun fact. Shout out to all of our underwater welders. Yeah. Sex is work. And here's where the Greek comedy comes in. You know how I know it's work? Because in the Greek comedy Lysistrata, they go on a sex strike. And if you can strike and it makes a difference, it's work. This is how I think all things should be measured. And I think it's true. This play is a comedy. It's supposed to be funny. This idea that in a society where women didn't have a lot of power, the one thing they can withhold in order to make a difference in policy is sex. And I think we need to treat it like it's important, because it is. I think we need to treat it with dignity, with respect, to take it seriously. Decriminalization is see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. That doesn't help anyone. I have never subscribed to ignorance is bliss. I have never subscribed to shove it away and hope it gets better, because maybe if we do something, we're helping pimps, and maybe sex trafficking maybe gets a little bit better, maybe gets a little bit worse. Probably exists on both sides of the house. Like so many tasks that have been called so-called women's work, the issue is that they are expected. That governments get away with not providing protection because it is expected. It is an understood assumption of what women will give to society. This looks like domestic labor. This looks like raising children. This looks like sex. And I think that when governments don't treat these tasks like actual work, they are refusing to acknowledge the untold labor that goes into society, not exclusively, but in large part done by women. I want sex work to be legal because I want sex work to be treated like work. I want it to be treated in an evidence-based approach where we favor the side which says less people die on our side of the house, when we say less people get sick on our side of the house. Because I don't know if the government is going to follow through on human trafficking. I would like to hope that they do, but I can't guarantee that. What we can guarantee in the debate is that we are acknowledging this work as work, treating it like work, regulating it, and ensuring compensation like it's work. And we are protecting workers like I think all societies should strive to do. For all these reasons, vote proposition.
Honourable guests, esteemed council, and my learned colleagues on the proposition bench, my name is Rory, and you might know me as Law Society's first year rep, the recipient of the First Year with the Biggest Notions Award at the Law Soc Ball, and also I was here as a featured speaker at the first debate of this season, which was, does size matter? Spoiler alert, it does not. You might also recognise me as last night I was in Law Soc's charity boxing event. Yes, I got a few punches to the face. I got a few back. I didn't win, but I'm still standing here, and today I am here representing the opposition. My learned colleagues on the proposition bench have rambled on in their liberal ways about why bodily autonomy is paramount to protections against abuse and vulnerable members of our society. They have also pontificated about the alleged conservative laws which are repugnant to the general consensus that sex work should be legalised. Now, I'm not fully against the legalisation of sex work. Sex is great. Like, sex is class. Sex work, it's not terrible. Like, I'm not saying that. And I would just like to say that our guest speaker so eloquently touched on how the current laws have failed so many workers. They're atrocious. However, it is most certainly a stretch to legalise all forms of sex work. I, a law student, I thought I'd get a round of applause there, no? Agree with the personal rights vested in our Articles 40 to 44 of our Constitution, and agree that we should vindicate the rights of including bodily integrity and freedom of expression. I am also a huge fan of John Stuart Mill, who brought about this belief that so long as one does not attack or endanger another in their actions, They should not be governed in their private actions, and they should be able to go about their life as they wish, without any judgment or any governance. This ideology, which was later debated in the House of Lords between Lord Devon and H.L.A. Hart in the 1950s on the topic of homosexuality and prostitution, paved the way for the decriminalisation of buggery and sodomy. However, I believe that homosexuality, an innate factor of one's makeup, compared to prostitution, which is a voluntary act where someone decides to exchange a sexual experience for money, cannot be put hand in hand, and for that matter, I do believe that is a bit of an insult to the LGBT community. However, I'll put that aside, as this was back in the 1950s. I do not think that all sex work should be banned, as I said. I believe in regulation and safeguarding. Pornography is an industry which has circulated the globe since early Christianity. For as long as there has been literature, there has been porn. After all, if I did not grow up on the dark side of Tumblr and Twitter, probably wouldn't have known my sexuality so soon. Anyways. But what is the difference between prostitution and pornography? There is a camera, and there are numerous people on set ensuring that actors are comfortable, sexually healthy, and are consenting. For prostitution, all it takes is for one person to give up their body in exchange for money. There is a lack of safety that is otherwise ascertained with the pornography industry. And I am not necessarily against the idea of prostitution, but rather the people it attracts. A plethora of studies have deduced that the vast majority of prostitutes have experienced traumatic sexual experiences growing up or face severe family issues. Another group attracted to this industry are those from a socio-economically disadvantaged background. We're talking about homeless people, college students, and members of different minority groups who, in particular, are marginalised by society through statistically lower pay compared to others in society, and who have no choice but to resort to submitting themselves to sexual experiences in return for a financial reward. Rather than legalising all sex work, these systemic issues instead should be addressed. On that note, we must beg the question, who is paying for sexual acts? How desperate can you be? In my opinion, what pleasures cannot be extracted from the bedroom that you need to pay for these sexual experiences? Are they extreme pleasures? Something that is taboo? Have you never heard of Grindr? Don't be funny. And even then, Tinder. Tinder is not used for long-standing romances. I don't think it ever has. Maybe that's just me. Anyways, there are many lacunas to the fundamental principles of prostitution. Now, just a trigger warning, I will be mentioning legal principles here. And I think, to be honest, this is reason enough why the HIST should never collab with the law sock. If we look at this from a contractual standpoint, both parties are giving something. The person soliciting sex work is offering their body, and the other person is offering money. This idea that they both accept and enter into performance of this contract, there is a connotation that neither party can remove consent or step back from this engagement. And if they do, this is a breach of contract. And one of the fundamental principles of contract is that if you break this contract, you must pay compensation, or there must be compensation of some sort. This idea that if you decide in the moment that you are to withdraw sex from the sexual experience or to withdraw consent, that you should be punished and that you should have to pay compensation is absurd, abhorrent, and sadistic in its nature. Yes?
What we talk about is drawing contracts and legislation that are specifically for sex work, so it wouldn't come together like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, and at the minute, we don't, sex work as it can't actually be formed in a legal contract. Of course, if it's in pornography, it can, because with the pornography, it is fully legal, it's fine, but if we're just going off the fundamental principles of sex work for it to be legalized in its entirety, So, aside from the people drawn into the industry and the conceptual argument behind sex work, we cannot ignore the moral standing, or lack thereof, behind prostitution. I'm in no way declaring what is morally valid, but rather what is known to be morally acceptable by wider society across the globe. Morals are subject to change and have been transformed on many issues for generations. It is abundantly clear that this issue is still taboo, which is reflected in laws around the world and societal views at large. Now, I know that you can argue for bodily autonomy. We should ideally be able to freely decide what we do with our own person. However, in this sad, dangerous world, it is unsafe to legalise all forms of sex work without proper safeguarding, which unfortunately could not be ascertained in reality in each instance of sex work. It is not just the issue of selling one's body for money, but also the people it attracts into this industry from both sides. It is imperative that while we extend our recognition of bodily autonomy and freedom of expression past the pre-decided views of religion, we must not forget the reasoning behind certain morals that have prevailed for centuries. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both sex havers and members of the HIST committee. My name is James Ryan, and I'm going to be strongly proposing the motion put before the House this evening that this House would legalise all sex work. Now, I will admit I was initially confused as to what we were debating this evening, not least because I'm a law student and I'm not sure what this sex thing you're all talking about is, but also that I was told this is about the world's oldest profession. And so here I was with a 7-minute-long speech in cuneiform, wasted. I have it all here. It's my entire speech as well. It's a waste of time. But nevertheless, I did persevere, and I do have a number of points to bring before you this evening. I think, one, the fact that sex work is an inevitability, the origins of sex as a social taboo, and the broader applications of the motion itself. And I do think the overarching theme of this debate, as was discussed by Kate earlier, is that sex is a human inevitability, and sex work as a whole. If history has taught us one thing, is that we just cannot keep it in our jocks. And so as such, we should try to regulate this practice and make it as safe and as ethical as possible. Looking around, sex work is incredibly commonplace in our society, even while participating in it is partially illegal for the purchaser. If you open up Twitter, you'll even find the HIST commenting, discourse in bio underneath stuff. So, in the name of research, I found myself lying on a set of silk sheets in a dark chamber in the little hours of the morning. This place, of course, being my bedroom, looking up escorts online. I tell you folks, I found some websites that are incredibly illegal to go on, especially escortsireland.ie. Their competitive rates, discretion guarantee, and frankly, quite helpful customer service are just horrific. But what is my actual point here? Sex work continues to exist in Ireland, even in its semi-legal status. Why not try to properly regulate it? And a big worry of those in the industry is the very valid concern of the exploitation of people who are in desperate situations, who turn to the sex work industry when other options in their life haven't panned out, as Owen's harrowing story did reveal for us today. But the purchase of sex being illegal contributes to a culture where victims fear speaking out lest they face repercussions. And I realize selling is fine, but even part of the transaction being taboo or illegal would scare anyone from going to the authorities. A fully transparent and legal marketplace can help dispel these worries and improve the treatment of those involved. What sex work needs is bureaucracy, which is actually coincidentally my safe word. Licenses, forms, statutes, besides really getting me going, are also necessary to document and ensure the market is free, it is safe, it's free of exploitation, and it's crucially perceived. It would also net some valuable tax money for the government to throw into the money chasm called the New Children's Hospital. And I feel like I'm yet to make a speech in this chamber without referencing gangster rap in some capacity. So here's a helpful line from 50 Cent to help illustrate my point. In Hollywood, there's no business like show business, but in the hood, there's no business like hoe business. And so bringing that potentially quite exploitive practice into the light through legal instruments is the best and I dare only way forward. And I realize attempts to revolutionize this stance haven't always gone to plan. Germany tried to maximize the efficiency and ethics of the industry through a sort of regulation and registration bill. And this led to perhaps my favorite headline of all time, Germany prostitution laws proving impotent. The lack of anonymity, it led to just 77 participants going to this program designed to enable workers to avail of benefits and protections afforded to all other workers who pay income tax. This was out of the tens, if not hundreds of thousands envisioned to be eligible to apply for such services. And this failure, I think, reveals a deeper social issue as to why they wish to remain anonymous. And that brings me to my next point, the historical background to sex work and the way we've grappled with it throughout the ages. To preface, sex workers are, of course, not only women, However, the broader, I think, social treatment of the industry has unfairly leveled the majority of its discrimination towards the women involved, and I'm going to historically deal with it through that lens. This week, I read a paper on medieval defamation, or to refer to it correctly, an antidote to insomnia. But many of these sort of disgusting and defamatory terms slung at sex workers were actually previously on the level of sort of knave or ruffian. It was a generalized term for everybody. But defamatory proceedings against women and their alleged infidelity warped these terms into the ones that they associate with sex work today. And so through religious fervour and cultural misogyny, we've condemned sex work to the fringes of society, despite continuous historical acknowledgement of its continued presence. In the Middle Ages, sex work was illegal within the city walls, quite literally placing it on the fringes of society. Canon law in the church went a step further, defining a prostitute merely as a promiscuous woman without discussing financial incentive at all. 19th century America saw sex work as necessary for men to obtain sex when their wife would not desire it. And it was only the temperance movement that saw its decline, the same movement that led to the abolition of alcohol and drug use. I would hope to think that this religion and cultural misogyny has marginalized and derided sex workers, especially women, for literal thousands of years. And I would hope that we've become a sufficiently accepting and progressive society to change this false perception. I was going to make kind of like an allyship feminist literature books joke here, but this isn't the Phil's Instagram Reels, so I'm not going to do that. But finally, I do think legalizing all sex work would have a broader positive impact to adjacent industries. I mean, recently we've only seen the introduction of intimacy coordinators in Hollywood, a famously an industry that's not really dealing with that very well. And so these people ensure that intimate scenes are done with kind of the utmost care and the continued consent of the actors involved. And I do think a more accepting society in relation to intimacy would only serve to improve our understanding and create a safer environment in these adjacent fields as well. So to conclude, I've discussed sex work's inevitability, its historical context, and briefly the wider impact of the motion as a whole. I think overall we all already agree here that two adults can do really what they want, as long as they're consenting, regardless of the financial motive, as long as it's a safe, monitored, and regulated environment. We've seen what decriminalization does. It doesn't work, so I don't think it's not really a bad thing to give legalization a try. So thank you all very much.
First of all, I just want to point out before I begin, somebody pointed out that I'm wearing all white. That makes me look like a virgin. I am not virgin. This was unintentional, okay? It's just the outfit. It's just the outfit that I've chosen for tonight. Okay. Ooh, little oratory box. Okay. I'm going to be like a nerd and a debater here and sort of start with a little bit of rebuttal. But I agree that sex work should be decriminalized and destigmatized. These workers should be protected by society and by the government. And I am deeply ashamed that we are failing them and that the state is abandoning them. But that said, I do not agree that the way to help is by legalizing all sex work. All right, with the state as well, I just want to touch on that prop has been very heteronormative and sort of with a male view. Women enjoy sex as well. Women can go get prostitutes, you know? And also the idea, Mary, of you being sex is a woman's job. It's not. Sex goes both ways. Sex is not a woman's job, okay? Sex goes both ways. And I think we should sort of appreciate that and sort of view that it is an equal playing field and it shouldn't just be on the woman to please the man at all times. I heavily disagree. All right, so I'm going to talk about two things, sort of norms and trust. So the key word in this debate is all sex work. This would mean, if we do legalize all sex work, that regulations would have to be put in place, and we know how sort of lax the government is with regulations and not really good at enforcing them. The Gardaí aren't that good, but this would mean more sort of widespread advertisement, and the internet is also really bad at regulating. There will be signs, places, people will be talking about it, and it will be more normalized. Now, it's good to destigmatize it on part of the sex worker, but in terms of normalizing it, especially with the idea of objectifying a woman and sort of seeing her body and this interaction as a transactional concept of sex rather than something that can be transactional, that can be a part of work, but it can also be intimate. it will sort of spread like wider issues within society, which are already present. We already have like huge issues with consent, and especially of women see their bodies being perceived as sort of objects that it's like you can just buy with being nice to them. Now, I'm going to touch on some like personal things, but from a young age, even before I grew, you know, these bad boys, I have been sexualized and touched without my consent. You know, it's not easy having the triple Ds. When I was swimming once, one of my classmates grabbed my boob. That didn't end well. I was 8 years old. When I was 12, a 14-year-old slapped my ass and said, I was just on display. I was just wearing a normal skirt. I've been called a big-titted cow on the bus. I've been called a slut whose ass has been hanging out for wearing a normal skirt. People have stared at my tits whenever they've talked to me. I've had friends say, oh, would you ever want to have like a threesome or anything like that? I mean, you seem like you'd be fun in bed. That's just not on my personality. Like, I know I'm great at cracking jokes and everything, but like, just because of the way I look, I shouldn't be seen as a sexual object. But that's how people perceive me a lot of the time because of my body and because of the fetishization of big-titted women. Like, the more we promote this idea of women's bodies being an object and interactions being transactional, the more this behavior is seen, and the more women who have big boobs are fetishized. The more young people will be pushed to sell their bodies to save up for college. The government is failing young people. We see like rent increases, housing crisis, all that. This will now, if this is normalized in the sense of like, what's it called, OnlyFans is normalized, it sort of will push young people and be like, oh, but like you can always turn to sex work. I mean, like, look at you do great in the industry. Like, sometimes if I do agree that it should be destigmatized and that we should be putting in these protections for sex workers, but when it becomes too normalized without regulations, then that's when people who are most vulnerable will be pushed to it. As has sort of been said on the prop, the most vulnerable people already go into this situation because you need little to nothing else, and there are zero boundaries, and it's where the most desperate turn. I fear that this being legalized and legalizing all sex work will leave those who are left, like abandoned by the state, feeling like they have no other choice but to turn to this field. I mean, like, people will tell you, well, if you're struggling with homelessness, you can always become a prostitute. It's legal now, you can get that money. If you're struggling with sort of saving up or paying your rent, you can become a prostitute. It's legal now. You can get that money. This will also, the state is really shit, guys. Like, I'm not gonna lie. This will also lead the state to be slower at addressing the root issues, which is lack of support and welfare from the state. They will also have biases and be like, well, they always have other options. We already are seeing sort of classism, violence against homeless people, and extreme xenophobia against immigrants, and how that's on the rise. I mean, the Dublin riots. You know, I don't trust people. I know this is very much of a cynic of me, but I don't trust people to then not turn around and go, oh, you've come into this country, you're struggling to get like welfare from the state, but you're an immigrant? Well, there's legal avenues now you can turn to. Yes?
I think I agree that there's a possibility increases, but it's not that people are going to turn to this more because it's legal. If you're at that point of desperation, I don't think it matters. People are slightly more likely to turn to it because it's safer, and I think that outweighs that.
I think, though, it's sort of the pressures of, like, society turning around and sort of being like, this is now an option, even if that person doesn't want to, them sort of being like, well, you can't complain about being homeless. You now have a legal option to do something about it. And which I agree that they should have that choice and that it should be decriminalized, and there should be safer measures in place to where it is actually a safe form of work. I don't think fully legalizing every single aspect of it will lead to sort of like not having that normalized and not having that bias in society. Now, so another point is sort of like touching on Owen's story. I do not trust the guards or the Gardaí or anybody like that to enforce these rules. They will already have these extreme biases against these women or other people working in this industry, and they will not be as likely to try and help them. I mean, you already saw the guards knew within Owen's story about what was going on, and they decided not to help because, it's not my issue, it's too dangerous for us. That will just continue. There will still be these issues there. They will still be less likely to help because it's a taboo subject. What we need to change is fully like putting in these protective measures in place where the guards have to help, where it's not taboo. We need to destigmatize it, but not fully legalize it without changing the root societal issues. The root societal issues of seeing women's bodies as objects, as seeing sex as a transactional thing that you can pay for either in money or by just being nice to a woman, and they should have to do it. This will also make consent a very sort of foggy area. I mean, like, we already see men being like, oh God, I was so nice to you, why don't I get to sleep with you? This consent will be harder to be revoked, or there could be more legal issues of being like, oh, but like I paid for it, and then somebody being like, no, I didn't. There would have to be a lot of legal work done to make sure that these contracts are in place. And that, like, it's a very formalized thing, which will also turn men, like, away from it who maybe want to do it. But anyway, that's beside the point. I don't have time for that. In total, and like overall, I just think we would need to be very careful with this, and I do think sex work needs to be destigmatized. But we need to recognize that destigmatizing it is different from making it fully legal, and decriminalizing it is different from making it fully legal, and it could lead to wider issues. Thank you.
All those in favour, please vote aye, and then everyone in favour, please shout aye, and then I'll go all those against, please vote nay, and you shout nay. All those in favour of the motion, please vote aye. Aye. All those against, please vote nay. Nay. I don't know if it's been quite so carried for this year. I would like to remind you all to submit your Irish returns on the way out. You can hand them to Mary, or you can put them straight into the ballot box. We're now going to, you're welcome to leave quietly if you'd like, but we're going to go straight into our private business meeting to announce the people running for our election.